You were guided long before you knew how to call yourself by name. I want you to picture this, not as a distant theory, but as a truth still breathing beneath the first layer of your memory. A truth most people feel only as a quick breeze in their daily life, never deep enough to make them stop. There are moments when you suddenly sense that an invisible hand touched you long ago, so gently that you thought it was just nature. And then, when you sit alone in a dark room or look out through a window on a quiet morning, you hear something thin as a thread of smoke. It feels like everything you believe about yourself has never fully belonged to you. The story began earlier than your memory can reach. Before you could speak your first word, before you knew love or fear, the world around you was already moving. The sounds you heard, the family voices, the gentle scolding, the laughter, the sighs, all carried hidden rules like fine threads weaving into you. No one intended to teach you how to live. They only repeated what they were once taught. Yet it is that very lack of intention that made everything perfect for a system of control no one realized existed. You grew up in a culture shaped thousands of years before you arrived. Ideas of what is right, good, and expected were passed down through generations, clinging to life like a thin layer of dust on old shelves. You breathed it in like air. You thought you were choosing, but you were only repeating. And as you got older, you learned about reward, a look of approval when you behaved, a frown when you cried too long. These signs were so small that people believed they meant nothing, but they were the first frame of your life, teaching you how to live in order to be accepted. At school, that frame became clearer. You were asked to sit still, listen, repeat, complete the template, and do exactly what the book said. If you asked a question at the wrong time, the teacher told you to stay quiet. If you acted differently, someone corrected you. Every small action was measured by an invisible ruler, a ruler of standardized correctness. No one ever said you existed to obey, but every experience pushed you toward that belief. As those years went on, you became used to seeking answers outside yourself instead of within. You listened to adults define success and explain what a good life should look like, and you assumed they knew something you did not. You read pages telling you what to fear and what to pursue. You began placing your value in achievements and in your ability to fit into shared patterns. You did not notice it as a child. No one did. But in those moments, you were losing your first connection to your true nature. Some children feel this as a tingling in their chest, a vague discomfort every time they force themselves to follow something that does not fit them. But because everyone around them lives that way, they believe the feeling is only a passing impulse they must ignore. Other children become silently withdrawn because they learn that silence keeps them safer than expression. Which child were you? Or were you both? Then you entered a larger world, where everything became so subtle that you no longer noticed you were being guided. Media stories told you what happiness looks like: a bright home, a stable job, a perfect partner. These images became the map for the life you believed you had to follow. But the most striking part is this: no one ever asked whether you wanted that map. You begin to observe more. Conversations in offices, in cafes, in places where adults gather, all circle around the same standards: salaries, titles, work hours, the familiar worries of busy grown-ups. No one asks about real feelings or the quiet thoughts that rise at night. Phrases like "just try harder" or "everyone has to live this way" show up again and again, like ancient mantras whose origins no one remembers. At some point in life, a few people begin to feel the mismatch. It might be a night when you look into the mirror a little longer than usual. It might be a morning when you wake and cannot understand why your heart feels so heavy. It might be a moment when you see someone living a completely different life, and for a few brief seconds, you feel as if you have forgotten something important. This realization is rarely loud. It often arrives as a quiet exhale or a long silence among the noise. But no matter how quietly it arrives, that realization is the first step toward a larger truth. You have been living in a world that placed everything into your hands without your consent. A world that made you believe your worth depended on doing things right, doing things well, doing things beautifully, and doing things like everyone else. A world that taught you to seek approval before seeking the truth inside yourself. From here, the story opens into another layer, not to blame society and not to make you run from it, but to help you see the small, invisible threads that have been woven into your mind since childhood. These threads are not bad. They only need to be seen clearly so that you can decide whether they still belong to you. And when you dare to look, the world begins to change its color. Because in the first moment you ask yourself if this is truly you, you step away from the starting point. Most people never leave. You do not need to change right away. You only need to know that this journey began the moment you became aware of it. And every step from here will be slower, deeper, and more honest than anything you have ever walked through before. When those first realizations begin to grow in silence, life still moves on like a familiar stream. You still wake up to the same mornings, still walk the same paths so familiar that your steps move automatically, still say the polite lines no one truly listens to. But beneath that steady surface, something is shifting, as if an old layer of earth is starting to crack. The strange part is that no one around you seems to feel it. They keep running after schedules, plans, and roles they know by heart. And it is that everyone lives this way that makes you doubt your own feelings. You begin to observe more conversations in offices, in cafes, in places where adults gather, all circle around the same standards, salaries, titles, work hours, the familiar worries of busy grown-ups. No one asks about real feelings or the quiet thoughts that rise at night. Phrases like, "just try harder," or "everyone has to live this way," show up again and again like ancient mantras whose origins no one remembers. You hear them, and suddenly they feel strangely hollow, like shells eaten away by time but still passed from hand to hand, because people are too used to them to let go. There are moments when you stand among a crowd and feel yourself drifting away, not because you want to leave them, but because you notice something in you no longer matches the rhythm of that life. A very specific kind of fatigue begins to settle, the kind felt by someone who has lived too long inside a mold. It is not exactly pain, but more like the long numbness of an arm held in one position for too long. You do not know when it started, but you feel it deepen each day. There are moments when you stand among a crowd and feel yourself drifting away, not because you want to leave them, but because you notice something in you no longer matches the rhythm of that life. A very specific kind of fatigue begins to settle, the kind felt by someone who has lived too long inside a mold. It is not exactly pain, but more like the long numbness of an arm held in one position for too long. You do not know when it started, but you feel it deepen each day. You remember childhood, when you once had thoughts that went against the flow, but you silenced them because you feared being judged, feared causing trouble, feared being seen as a failure. Now each of those memories returns like an old mirror reflecting moments when you chose silence instead of truth. And you realize that silence was not because you were timid, but because you had been taught too many times that being different brings trouble, that showing your true nature invites cold eyes. You start noticing the ones who look too successful in society's eyes, the carefully prepared smiles on social media, the achievement stories told smoothly and neatly as if edited by a team. You see them under bright stage lights, but never see what is behind the curtain. And that makes you wonder if they are truly happy, or if they too are chasing an image someone else built for them. Media tells you countless stories. It creates models. Success must look like this. Love must happen like this. Happiness must come from those things. But no one tells you that these models were not created to help you live by your heart, but to make you consume. You chase what you think are dreams, but sometimes they are only dreams packaged with a shining surface. Have you ever wondered why just one compliment that says you are on the right path makes you feel relieved? And when no one says anything, why you worry you are wrong? These reactions are not your true nature. They are the result of years being trained to believe your value lives in an external mirror. No one forces you to live this way with orders. They do it with habits. And habits repeated thousands of times become stronger than any rule. Sometimes the scariest truth is not that you are controlled. It is that you have forgotten what it feels like to control yourself. You may sense this clearly on a late night, when you no longer have the strength to convince yourself that everything is fine. A night when you look around your room and realize your life resembles a nicely decorated house with no owner. You walk, work, and respond on schedule without knowing who wrote the schedule. And in that small pocket of silence, where the mask of adulthood slips off, you begin to understand that the discomfort inside you is not a malfunction. It is the first sign of awakening, because only when someone begins to feel the tightness of the room do they realize they are inside a room. Before that, they believe the whole world is that small. You are not as lost as you think. You are simply beginning to see edges most people never notice. From the moment you sense that, life begins to have two layers. the layer others see, and the layer only you can feel. The outer layer stays the same: work, bills, conversations, polite smiles. But the inner layer begins to tremble. Pieces inside you that once fit now shift out of place. This does not make you different from others. It only makes you a little more honest with yourself. And sometimes that small honesty is enough to pull you away from your old orbit. You do not yet know what you want, but you are beginning to know what no longer belongs to you. Sometimes the scariest truth is not that you are controlled. It is that you have forgotten what it feels like to control yourself. You may sense this clearly on a late night, when you no longer have the strength to convince yourself that everything is fine. A night when you look around your room and realize your life resembles a nicely decorated house with no owner. You walk, work, and respond on schedule without knowing who wrote the schedule. You are not as lost as you think. You are simply beginning to see edges most people never notice. From the moment you sense that, life begins to have two layers: the layer others see and the layer only you can feel. The outer layer stays the same: work, bills, conversations, polite smiles. But the inner layer begins to tremble. Pieces inside you that once fit now shift out of place. You observe more, you listen more, and sometimes you feel as if you are walking through a room full of echoes, where every sound is a repetition of thousands who came before you. You begin to realize that most of what people call truth is really only habit. A chain of patterns passed from one person to another. Like old heirlooms no one dares to throw away because they are too familiar to be questioned. The people around you, no matter how strong or successful they seem, are moving along the same tracks. But the confidence they show on the outside may not match what they carry inside. If you listen closely, you will notice the fear neatly folded beneath their voices. Fear of not being good enough, fear of falling behind, fear that one day someone might see the emptiness they have tried so hard to hide. What makes you pause the longest is realizing that most of the dreams you thought were yours were planted there by stories. Stories in classrooms, on television, in movies that made your young heart tremble. You saw the image of a successful person, walking confidently through a large office, living in a bright apartment, holding a clean and ideal life. That image stayed in you like a seed, but no one ever said that the seed was not planted by you. And then one afternoon, while you are sitting in a cafe with amber light touching the tables, you hear someone speak about a successful person. They speak with admiration, speak of wealth and fame and things that shine like glass outside the window. But when they fall silent, you hear something else, a longing that does not belong to them, but to the mold society taught them to carry. Even the words used to describe sadness, failure, loss, all softened and blurred so they do not feel too sharp. So everything becomes easier to swallow. But at the same time, people lose the ability to name what is truly happening inside them. You look back at yourself and see that for years, you tried to match a rhythm that was never yours. You worked hard, pinned achievements to your chest like medals, smiled in the right places because you believed that is what adults must do. But there were nights when you lay down and looked at the ceiling and knew clearly that a part of you had never been touched. That part quietly asked, if this is not the life I want, then why am I still living it? What makes you pause the longest is realizing that most of the dreams you thought were yours were planted there by stories. Stories in classrooms, on television, in movies that made your young heart tremble. You saw the image of a successful person, walking confidently through a large office, living in a bright apartment, holding a clean and ideal life. That image stayed in you like a seed, but no one ever said that the seed was not planted by you. This is also the moment when someone searching for themselves may feel more fragile than ever, because when you become more awake, you also become more sensitive to what surrounds you. Every glance, every careless comment, every expectation from family or acquaintances can make you hesitate. But that fragility is also proof that you are opening up, living honestly, touching layers of emotion you once buried under tasks and achievements. And if while listening to this story you feel less alone, if a small thought makes you want to share or leave a small mark on your journey back to yourself, you can write a few lines in the comments, not to tell a complete story, but to place down a personal milestone. Sometimes admitting what you feel is enough to open a door you did not expect. If you want more stories with this rhythm, you can stay, because sometimes simply walking with a voice that understands you is enough to make the road feel less dark. When you stay quiet long enough, you begin to realize something important. The world does not control people with crude force. What holds them back is not chains, but compliments, not prohibitions, but advice that sounds right, not commands, but the fear of being seen as someone who chooses differently. And then you see another layer, deeper and more subtle. That fear no longer comes from outside. It has become a voice inside you. You correct yourself before anyone else can. You shrink your dreams before anyone can tell you they are too big. You blame yourself for feelings that should have been heard. That is when you understand the deepest control does not live in society's structures, but in the thoughts of the individual, where people tighten themselves, shape themselves, imprison themselves inside walls they believe are safe. But that understanding also opens a new possibility. If the prison is inside you, then the key is inside you too. And the journey begins when you dare to face the voice that has guided you for so many years without ever being questioned. Once you hear that whisper, you cannot return to who you were, because you have begun to see the small cracks running across the surface of your life. Cracks that are not as frightening as you imagined, but are the first rays of freedom. If you are ready to go deeper into that inner layer, the story will lead you to the next part, where you learn to see clearly the shadows that have guided you for so long, not to hate them, but to understand why you once leaned on them your whole life. From the moment you notice the small cracks in your life, everything begins to show itself more clearly, not in a loud collapse, but like an old wall slowly absorbing water, silent, gradual, and impossible to reverse. Each passing day, you feel yourself seeing the world with a new layer of vision. Things that once felt normal now seem questionable. Words that once sounded smooth now carry a faint sting. You are not sure whether you are changing or simply remembering who you have always been. But whatever it is, you know you can no longer pretend the way you used to. You begin to notice what you once ignored. Language. Not the grand sentences, but the small words repeated every day. When someone says it is just a small thing, you realize they are hiding a wound they are afraid to name. When people say this is normal, you can sense the exhaustion under the word normal, as if they are trying to convince themselves more than they are convincing you. That is when you understand the deepest control does not live in society's structures, but in the thoughts of the individual, where people tighten themselves, shape themselves, imprison themselves inside walls they believe are safe. You see clearly how society polishes language, makes it smoother, cleaner, easier to digest, as if real emotion is too strong and must be filtered so it does not disturb anyone. People call pain a challenge, call loss a period of transition, call slow erosion a busy schedule. These wrappings create the illusion that all suffering has a reasonable explanation, that no one is ever allowed to stop and admit they are not okay. But when you look closely enough, you realize that this cleaning of language is not meant to protect you. It is meant to protect the system that needs everyone to keep functioning, keep smiling, keep saying I am fine, even when they are falling apart inside. A smoothly running society does not need people who are too honest. It needs people who know how to hide their feelings at the right time and smile at the right level. You begin to see something else. People who dare to question or live differently from the common ideal are labeled very quickly. They are called too sensitive, too extreme, too different, too complicated. You realize these labels do not describe them. They describe the fear of the majority. The fear that if one person dares to break the pattern, then everyone else might have to face the possibility that the pattern was never right. And then you remember your own moments of being labeled. Times when you were simply sad and were told you were exaggerating. Times when you wanted to rest and were labeled irresponsible. Times when you wanted to speak honestly, but were shut down by do not make this bigger than it is. In those moments, you did not fight. You stayed silent to keep the peace. But deep inside, each silence closed yet another door in you. You begin to understand that control does not come from some obvious force. It comes from countless small details people are taught to believe. From advice that sounds reasonable, from expectations disguised as love, from the fear of being separated from the group. Control does not need authority. It only needs to tell the same stories enough times for you to stop trusting your own voice. At some point, you stand in the kitchen under warm yellow light and realize that you have not truly spoken your real thoughts for a long time. You are using the language others are used to hearing, not the language that rises from your heart. You speak more gently, more neatly, more reasonably, but also farther away from yourself. This awareness makes you pause, not because you are afraid, but because you are surprised by how subtle the invisible ropes have been, tying you down for years. You wonder how many times in your life you stayed silent because you believed your voice was too bothersome, too different, too unsuitable. And when you look around, you see that people near you are living the same way. Each person has an original voice inside them, but most have been pushed down for so long that they no longer remember its true tone. You realize that what people call normal is one of the strongest forms of control. Because once something is labeled normal, people assume it cannot be questioned. They continue it, repeat it, pass it on, without ever asking why. Normal is not truth. Normal is only the habit of the majority. One quiet evening, alone with the ticking clock, you sit and realize how many years you have lived inside the safety of normal. That safety does not hurt, but it does not feel real either. It gives you stability, but takes away aliveness. It gives you belonging, but erases freedom. And then what you once called stability begins to feel like a beautifully decorated room with windows forever closed. You could stay there forever, but you also know you will never breathe deeply if you remain inside it. You begin to understand why some people change direction after only a small event in their life, not because the event is massive, but because their soul has been full of unsaid things, unlived truths, unacknowledged pain. When the event comes, it does not destroy them. It only switches on the truth they hid from themselves. Now, as you enter this layer of awareness, you see clearly that control is not an external prison closing in. It is a thin mist covering your perception, preventing you from seeing your true shape. And when you begin to wipe away that mist, life comes into focus, both beauty and pain, both freedom and responsibility. The remarkable thing is this: as soon as you see the structure of control clearly, it no longer holds you as tightly. Because the strongest form of bondage is never chains. It is unexamined belief. And when that belief begins to tremble, you begin to move. But to understand more deeply why people confine themselves to these patterns, you need to enter a deeper layer, the layer of fear. Because fear, not external pressure, is what makes people shrink into the boxes built from what they once believed was safety. From the moment you recognize the structure of language and the invisible patterns that shaped your life, the movements inside you grow deeper. You begin to feel that something stands between you and the life you truly want to live. Not a person, not a circumstance, but a thin layer of shadow, cold and familiar. You realize that this shadow has a name even if no one says it out loud: fear. It does not crash in like a storm. One quiet evening, alone with the ticking clock, you sit and realize how many years you have lived inside the safety of normal. That safety does not hurt, but it does not feel real either. It gives you stability, but takes away aliveness. It gives you belonging, but erases freedom. You look back at your path and see clearly that most of the important decisions in your life were guided by the fear of losing acceptance. As a child, you behaved because you feared being scolded. When you grew older, you followed the roads others approved of because you feared being judged. When you entered adulthood, you feared failure, so you avoided change. You feared poverty, so you chased things that were not right for you. You feared loneliness, so you stayed in connections that made you smaller. You feared strange looks, so you buried the most beautiful parts of yourself. That fear did not come from outside. It was planted like tiny, harmless dust until it formed a thick layer that blocked your vision. You realize that society's familiar stories always feed fear. Do not dream too far. Do not be different. Do not step out of the line. Do not choose the road few people walk. These pieces of advice sound like care, but deep down, they keep you in the familiar space where the system needs you to stay. In truth, fear is not the enemy. It is only a part of you that has not been understood, a part you once used to protect yourself from feeling left behind. But when it grows out of control, it becomes a shackle. You begin to see something sad. Some people live their entire lives only to avoid fear, not to move toward what they truly desire. One evening, sitting on an old chair under warm yellow light, you realize for the first time that fear has guided you more than your dreams. The realization shocks you, not because you regret anything, but because you understand that for many years, you have not lived with full self-direction. You have only existed in a state of reaction. And then you look outward at the people around you. You see that they carry the same fears: fear of being replaced, fear of being forgotten, fear of not being important. Some abandon their passions because they believe they have no right to follow them. Some stay in draining jobs because they think change is too dangerous. Some avoid love because they fear their hearts will break again. They live as if life were a room full of traps, and the only safe option is to stand still. You begin to ask, who taught them to fear like this? Who taught you? No single face appears, because fear does not come from one person. It comes from a culture that places obedience above truth. A culture that treats stability as the highest standard even when its cost is a soul slowly falling asleep. One day, sitting on a park bench, you see a child run toward the lake, even though their mother says, "Be careful." Not because the child wants to rebel, but because curiosity outweighs fear. And you suddenly remember that you were once like that too. Everyone was. Before fear was taught into you, you ran toward what you wanted with an open heart. So what made us lose that original courage? You ask this question and realize something important. Society does not extinguish courage with force. It extinguishes it with repetition. Repeating images of failure, repeating safe advice, repeating the fears of the previous generation, repeating them until you no longer remember that there was once a part of you that did not know what fear was. But to continue, to truly touch the freedom you once believed you did not deserve, you must face one last and most important truth. To live as your true identity, you must dare to step into change. But at the same time, you realize that fear is not the ending point. It is a doorway. And that doorway only opens when you dare to look at fear directly, without running, without justifying. When you name the true fear, not its surface symptoms, you begin loosening the knots that have tied you for years. In the quiet nights, you feel something strange. Behind fear, something is waiting for you. Not danger the way you imagined, but a wider space. A space where you can breathe deeply without needing permission, where what you want does not need to be justified, where you no longer need to play the role of someone who always has the right answer. And this brings you to a new level of awareness. What binds people is not society's rules, but the fear of stepping outside them. But when you reach this threshold, where fear is no longer a wall but only a thin mist, you begin to feel another pull, a pull that is not strong or loud, but undeniable, the call of your true self. To recognize that call, you must continue going deeper, into the place where truth has been hidden most carefully, the realm of identity. Because no one can be truly free until they understand who is living inside them and why that part has been forgotten for so long. When you go deeper into the layers of fear that once held you still, a new question begins to rise, not from the mind, but from a deeper place that has been silent for too long. If fear is only a layer of mist over your eyes, then who is underneath it? You realize you cannot continue this journey without facing the most essential truth. Your identity is not your name, your job, or the roles you have become familiar with. It is something softer, wider, and far harder to name. In the days you begin observing yourself, you notice something strange. You've been living as if an invisible frame surrounds you, telling you what you are allowed to do, how far you are allowed to dream, and what you are allowed to want. And each time you try to step beyond that frame, even a little, a wave of unease rises, as if you have done something wrong. You look back and see that this frame was not built by you. It was woven from years of silence, from the expectations of adults, from advice that seeped into you when you were too young to question any of it. Now, as you enter this layer of awareness, you see clearly that control is not an external prison closing in. It is a thin mist covering your perception, preventing you from seeing your true shape. And when you begin to wipe away that mist, life comes into focus, both beauty and pain, both freedom and responsibility. That version does not care how you appear in someone else's eyes. It does not try to please anyone. It only wants you to live in a way that makes you feel truly alive. It once lived inside you when you were small, before fear was taught into you. It knows what you love, what you want, what you long for, the things you abandoned as you grew older. But as you touch this part of yourself, you feel something else rise, resistance, not from others, but from within. A part of you whispers that being true will cost you the stability you have grown used to, that you will be seen as someone who does not follow the rules, that you may lose the acceptance you worked so long to earn. This is the quiet conversation between the different versions of you, the pieces shaped by many stages, many fears, many lessons. On the nights you cannot sleep, You hear this conversation more clearly. One part of you wants to open the door, wants to step out, wants to breathe as yourself again. But another part warns you that the world outside is not safe. You sit between these two forces, feeling torn in half, wanting freedom, and fearing it at the same time. This conflict is not your fault. It is the result of years spent living through roles that helped you survive certain chapters of your life. There were times you had to be strong to avoid judgment. There were times you had to be silent to keep the peace. There were times you had to push yourself to meet demands you did not dare refuse. These roles once protected you, but now they make the same mistake. They forget that you have grown and you no longer need them as much as before. You begin to understand that identity is not something that is handed to you. It is something you must uncover, name, and choose for yourself. Your true identity does not exist in the story others write for you, but in the decisions you genuinely want to make, even when they contradict the familiar expectations around you. One afternoon, as you walk down a long street covered in fallen leaves, you feel this truth more clearly than ever. There are rare moments when you feel as if you are coming home, even though you are standing somewhere far away. Moments when you laugh with pure instinct without adjusting yourself. Moments when a piece of music softens your heart and you do not feel ashamed. Moments when you see someone walking freely and for half a second you realize how deeply you want that too. These moments are small, but they are signs. They are thin threads revealing that your true identity is still alive, still waiting for you to return to it even after all these years. You realize that what keeps people stuck is not that they do not know who they are. It is that they have never allowed themselves to ask the question seriously. For so long, you lived as a sketch, a collection of roles, reactions, and borrowed desires. When you peel away the layers, you do not find the emptiness you feared. You find a wide, quiet, unfamiliar space, the space of possibilities you once did not dare to touch. In that space, you begin hearing a very soft call, just enough to make you tilt your head and listen, not strong enough to force you to act. It tells you that your life can be wider, deeper, more honest, that you do not have to stay as the person you once were, that you have the right to be reborn in this lifetime without waiting for a major crisis or a miracle. But to continue, to truly touch the freedom you once believed you did not deserve, you must face one last and most important truth. To live as your true identity, you must dare to step into change, not change to become someone else. Change to come back to yourself. You begin to look at each part of your life, your habits, your work, your relationships, your expectations, and ask a question you never had the courage to ask before: does this truly belong to me? A simple question, yet earth-shaking. Because once you dare to ask it, you cannot pretend you do not know the answer. When you stand at the threshold of change, everything suddenly becomes quiet in a strange way. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of a forest at the break of dawn, still, deep, and full of unnamed possibilities. You feel clearly that this is the moment your entire silent journey has been leading you toward. A part of you wants to step forward. Another part pulls you back. But for the first time, you no longer run from the question. You stand upright, look at it, and admit that you are standing at the edge of a different life. You realize that freedom does not come from cutting everything off. Freedom comes when you are no longer guided by invisible patterns. When you see yourself clearly, the world stops being a stage where you must play a predetermined role. It becomes a space where you can choose each step, each breath, each small desire. But this does not happen all at once. You have lived many years inside stories written for you by others, so stepping out of them takes patience. There are days you move forward and feel lighter, but there are also days you step back because old anxieties rise again. That is completely normal. Anyone who has gone through this knows that true freedom does not arrive with fireworks. It begins with very quiet shifts, like the way a lake changes when a soft breeze passes over it. You begin to look at each part of your life, your habits, your work, your relationships, your expectations, and ask a question you never had the courage to ask before: does this truly belong to me? A simple question, yet earth-shaking. Because once you dare to ask it, you cannot pretend you do not know the answer. There are things you discover that still warm your heart when you think of them. Those things you keep. They are proof that not everything in your life came from pressure. hidden among the years, were choices you made from your true heart. And those choices become the foundation on which you rebuild your life. You do not need to drop everything in one day. You only need to begin telling yourself the truth, one truth at a time, one small piece at a time. That is how you loosen the old garment around you, not by tearing it off, but by gently untying each knot. And this is the threshold leading into the final chapter, where you do not only understand control, fear, or identity, but begin learning how to move beyond them. One small step, but the first step toward a life where you are no longer merely existing, but truly living. During this process, you discover a kind of freedom stronger than breaking any chain, the inner freedom that says, I can live my way even if the world does not agree. This freedom comes when you stop seeking approval from people who do not live your life. Stop chasing standards that do not belong to you. Stop fearing that you will be left out of the crowd. You realize that what you feared most was not changing your life. It was the possibility of walking part of the journey alone. But when you look back, you understand something important. You were never truly alone. You simply had never stayed with yourself in the right way. Now you begin to stay. You listen to your own breath, your small desires, the things that make your heart tremble or soften. And when you stay with yourself long enough, you realize that life does not ask you to be perfect. It only asks you to be honest. Honest with your pain, your dreams, your fragility, and even the parts you once tried to hide. You do not have to be strong all the time. You do not have to fit perfectly. You do not have to disguise your emotions. Honesty is the path that takes you out of the old circles. One morning, as sunlight comes through the window, you open your eyes and feel something you had never felt so clearly. You have the right to choose. The right to say no to what no longer belongs to you. The right to step out of stories that are not yours. The right to begin again, slow or fast, depending on your own heartbeat. And the right to live in a way that feels light, whole, and true, even if no one applauds you for it. You understand that the path to freedom is not a rebellion against the world. It is a return to the self you lost while chasing expectations, a return to the part of you that knows what you need, what you want, what you long for, a return to the silence of your soul where no other voice takes over. And in that return, you begin to see the future in a new light, not a future built on the standards of others, but on your own truth. Not a future shaped by fear, but by real desire. Not a future meant to please the world, but one that makes you feel alive with meaning. At the end of this journey, you stand before a door with no lock. It does not ask you to prove anything. It simply invites you to walk through when you are ready. And when you place your hand on that door, you realize that the thing that held you the most was never society or other people, but the story you were taught to believe about yourself. Now you can rewrite that story. Not loudly, not with grand declarations, only with a gentle, steady choice to live a life where you can feel yourself inside it. And when you do that, you understand the deeper meaning of a sentence you may have heard before, but only now truly feel. You are the author of your own becoming, and from this moment on, you begin to become yourself, fully, quietly, and beyond return. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If this message touched your heart, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss the next journey we take together. Your support means the world to me.